Many modern day BMWs come equipped with this B58 engine that everybody's touting as reliable, tunable, long lasting, and a vehicle that's easy to own outside of warranty. Finally, BMW has an engine that will last 250,000 miles that I would actually consider buying, and you can find it in many of their major models. Let's get into it now. Life's too short to drive boring cars. The B58 engine you won't find in the smaller entry-level vehicles like the X1 or the X2 because these are predominantly a front-wheel drive platform for the extra drive going to the back wheels for a little extra support. The B58 engine can be found in 2 series with the rear-wheel drive like the 240, or you can find it in M340i, which denotes with that 40 series means you get the B58 engine. The BMW X5 as well. You can also get an upgraded twin-turbo V8, but the 40 series is the entry-level drive for the X5. You can also get it in the X3 like this one here. You'll notice is the M40i that denotes also the 40 generation means it's got the B58. You can also find it in the X4 and the X6 like this, as you'll notice the 40 series. You can also find it in the 740, the 7 series, or the X7, the full-size 3-row SUV. BMW puts it in many of their models. Now it first came out in about 2015 when they switched out from the N55 before that, and in 2016 they came out with this great new engine. Had a whole host of new features, but there was also a technical upgrade back in 2019, and that's where I want to put this down, because 2019 2020 is when they came out with the upgraded version of the B58, although there was a big issue, and 2021 is actually where you really want to buy in. Many tout that the BMW B58 engine is one of the most reliable engines in the luxury car segment, period. Toyota even borrowed a similar drivetrain for their Toyota Supra. It's a 3-liter single turbo twin scroll inline 6-cylinder engine, and it's predominantly driving power to the rear wheels, with many of the upgrades to xDrive giving you all-wheel drive. This couples up to the gloriously reliable ZF 8-speed automatic transmission, which is also another bulletproof component to this whole drivetrain. Now the beauty is the B58 engine came with a whole host of enhancements over its predecessor, the N55. So many complaints of the N55 engine before it were some of the major issues on the cooling system. The older engines had the water pump that were electric at the bottom, the T-stat, they were bolted together, and it was an extremely long job and drawn out process to get that replaced. Unfortunately, they only lasted 50 to 60,000 miles and then they were gone. The new engines came with a heat encapsulation system as well, which reduced the amount of high and low swings, particularly in colder temperatures. Of course, did reduce the amount of cracking and fatigue on some of the plastics under the hood. Closed deck engine design, no longer relying on the head gaskets to keep the coolant in. It's a closed loop design, and of course you didn't have to worry about blown head gaskets for these new engines. Now, like everything, you learn as you go, and BMW's been making enhancements to these engines for a long time. They're better and better every single year. But in 2019, when they upgraded that TU upgrade, of course, to the B58, along came an upgraded oil pump, which unfortunately had a plastic housing, and these plastic rings were prone to failure. So unfortunately, the B58, as great as it was and the improvements that they've seen in 2019 and early 2020, they saw an oil pump failure with plastics that meant that quite often you ran out of oil potentially, and there were cases of that. If you got yourself into a 2021, all of a sudden there was an upgraded part, you could in fact get your earlier model upgraded with the later part and get yourself reliability as you would expect. They shed the electric water pump with the newer generation of B58, and now instead they use a mechanical water pump. Now that has been known to be slightly problematic, but it's more of a matter of general coolant consumption. Now see, that's one of the issues that a lot of owners are complaining about. They tend to sort of dissipate coolant. Sure, there's your classic coolant leaks that you're getting in any BMW, and the B58 just seems to carry on that tradition in some cases. Although some of the parts are easier to replace and cheaper to replace, the fact remains is many of those parts can still potentially leak. Water pump being one of them, now it's a mechanical water pump. There's other changes that were not always the best. The PCV, of course, the positive crankcase ventilation, that could cost you $500 to $1,000 to replace. A lot of owners that keep their BMWs for a lot longer either replace their PCV at the dealer for $800, $1,000, $1,200 all in replaced, or some just do a bypass and put a catch can and leave it and never have to worry about that problem again. But the PCV is not an uncommon problem. The complexity of a lot of these modern day direct injected turbo engines means that BMW, Mercedes, Audi, nobody is exempt from these problems with the positive crankcase ventilation. Coolant leaks. Of course, now they have a dual section coolant tank tank, and the reservoirs, you actually have two different loops. Unfortunately, there's been common issues with the caps on the coolant reservoirs potentially leaking and bubbling over. Of course, that does cost you a little bit of money and a more of an inconvenience at the shop, as well as some of the problems related to the odd hose that people are starting to see degrade at 80, 120, 150,000 miles. Now, I've heard people on the forum say, oh, it cost me 15 grand. I was quoted by the dealer to do a full rehose on the BMW. That's ludicrous. Even if you do a radiator, water pump, full hose upgrade, you're still not going to come anywhere near that. Ultimately, it's very labor intensive and the components are quite pricey like any BMW are, but it's not something you're constantly chasing and worried about. The big thing is, of course, just staying on top of any leaks or problems. Maintain that BMW, and the B58 will last for hundreds of thousands of miles. Another problem with the B58, sadly, for some odd reason, they went and put the timing chains at the firewall like they've been doing for many years with the N47s and some of the N20s, rather than at the front of the engine where they typically are located. Where that becomes a bigger issue is the VANOS solenoids, which are located up by the timing chains. And the VANOS solenoids are a problem that have been known to fail from time to time. Now, they are considered a maintenance item, but contrary to a lot of people saying that, yes, when your solenoids go, you're going to have to drop an engine, that's actually not true. It is very difficult to gain access to those VANOS solenoids, but there is special tooling required to actually change that adequately. So you don't have to drop the engine. It does help if you're doing an engine out service or transmission out service. It does make sense to change your solenoids while you're in there. How do you know you're going to get a problem? Well, usually a check engine light is going to spit that out and tell you on the dash, or what you're going to find is sluggish performance, sloppiness. It's not going to drive all that well. You might get holding your throttle in and you're going to get this surging. That's one of the key symptoms you're going to find when you have solenoids, because the solenoids are there to give you maximum performance down low as well as top breathing up top. And when you lose that attitude and you lose that perspective, it tends to just start to wander, and that's one of the classic symptoms. Another problem that some people have is the valve cover gaskets. A lot of those tend to fail, and a lot of times the valve covers themselves, made out of plastic, have been known to crack with some age. If they crack, you might as well just do them while you're in there, do a gasket. But the valve cover gasket and the valve cover itself have been known to leak. And you might get check engine light. If you're doing your spark plugs, you might actually know a lot of oil around the plugs. That could be a sign. You might get that smelling, burning waft of burning oil on the hot exhaust manifold. That might be a giveaway, but ultimately leaks on the floor, or the fact that you have to constantly add oil. Because these engines don't generally burn a lot of oil, if you're starting to see a change where you're starting to consume oil, that could be a surefire indicator you have a valve cover gasket leak or a broken valve cover. Now, another common issue that hasn't really gone away with the B58 was the oil filter housing. Now, there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, there's the oil filter housing. There's an O-ring between the oil filter housing and the cooler, and they can leak, and you can get mixing, oil, coolant mixing, and of course that's a bad thing. In my older N54, I had that issue, but it's an issue that seems to be hanging on with the N55 as well as the B58. After so many miles, you're gonna have to change out those gaskets. There's a little bit of mild labor on that. I mean, for my vehicle, I had to take apart a bunch of the equipment on the front just to gain access to one of the bolts. And so it ended up costing me about 5-6 hours on the driveway as a DIYer. Now, a shop's going to charge a lot less and the parts aren't that expensive, but it's something you got to be thinking about. And the oil filter housing has known to actually break off or split the oil filter inside. And then there's been cases where people have actually had to scrap it and put an entire new housing on board. Now, if the dealer's going to do it on their dime, sure, why not? But basically, that's an expense that you don't need to incur. My recommendation is do more frequent oil changes. These 10,000 mile oil services are one of the worst things that we're hearing in the industry. Sure, while the oil might be able to take it, there's a lot of crud and corrosion. Do more frequent oil services. Keep on top of your oil changes. Check your coolant levels. Make sure your levels are always where they should be. If fluids are starting to go away, investigate why that is. Those are the key reasons why the B58 engine would fail. Otherwise, they're a solid engine, very tunable. And remember, there's a lot of output available on the table. With the maximum output of around 382 horsepower out of the box, it's not uncommon to find a lot of people able to put down closer to 700 and 800 horsepower tuned. Why? Because the internals of that engine, we're talking about forged crank and connecting rods, we're talking about closed deck cooling, we're talking about better turbocharging, the fuel system's upgraded. The engine can take it, but do your maintenance, and that's one of the key elements. The other thing is a lot of the modern day B58 engines are now coupled up. You'll notice with mild hybrid systems, you'll see you've got the M badging on the front, and of course, it's a whole new design look. You know, you've got these different calipers and M badging and all of that greatness. Look, it's a whole new restyle to the X3, but this one here is called the 50, because now you're dealing with the 48 volt mild hybrid. So now you have a system that's even more complex. The B58, the ZF 8-speed transmission, as well as, of course, you have now a mild hybrid system that's going to give you a little extra performance. Look after the maintenance, stay on top of it, and these engines can run 2 to 250,000 miles. And with all of that said, everybody, right there, be sure to check in some of the key BMWs I would buy and the only ones I would likely buy. Hope to see each and every one of you real soon, everybody. See you then. Bye-bye.